Thanks for coming today. I'm Nat O'Grady, senior lecturer in Geography and Disasters in Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute here at Manchester. We've put this event together with the Department of Geography. It's an immense pleasure of mine to introduce Ben Anderson and Anna Secor, who will talk about their new book, The Politics of Feeling, today. So just as a little introduction, so Anna is a professor in geography at the University of Durham University. She's one of the foremost figures in feminist, political and cultural geography. Research focuses on many of the issues kind of central to the different departments represented in the room today, I think. So this includes her groundbreaking work on Islamic cultural politics as they play out in contemporary Turkey. Also her crucial work on trauma and refugee resettlement as well. At the same time, she's played a leading role in bringing geographical theory into dialogue with psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and really pushed our thinking about the negative in geography in recent years. She's been prolific in producing work of extremely high quality, including articles like Space-Time Unconscious, Problem of the Future in the Space of Resettlement, Post-Secular Geographies and the Problem of Pluralism, and also the edited collection with Paul Kingsbury called Place More Void, which I really enjoyed. On to Ben. Ben's also professor in geography at Durham, one of the preeminent voices in cultural and political geography. His work's been integral to the development of geographies of affect over the last 15 years, and he's used this frame to make significant contributions to our thinking about the politics of emergency in the future, and also the rise of right-wing populism in our kind of contemporary moment, which I think that both speakers will be talking about today. So some of my favourite Ben's work includes the 2014 book Encountering Affect, Slow Emergencies with Kevin Grove, amongst others, Matt Kearns, Lauren Rickards as well. What kind of things? Resilience, neoliberal affects and everyday Brexits as well. Just to say a little bit about the book. So, you know, Ben and Anna have been working together for many years now, and their book, Politics of Feeling, Progressivism, Liberalism, Populism, came out in July of 2025, and I think that Aurora and I were desperate to bring the both of them to Manchester because of how important we think the book is for developing modes of critique that allow us, if not to make sense of, at least to have a little bit of a grasp and stay attuned with the ever-unfolding turbulence of our current political conjunctural crisis. And without further ado, I'll hand the stage over to you guys.
Thank you, Nat, for like a typically generous introduction to Anna and I and our work. Thank you, Nat and Aurora, for the work you're doing, and thank you, Andrew, for all the logistical work. As people know, there's a lot of background work goes into putting together an event. It's lovely to see so many people here. Yeah, there's loads of space. Yeah, go for it. So on the eve of Donald Trump's inauguration, second inauguration, he danced on stage with members of the village people. As he danced, he performed a promise that he previously offered his supporters. The promise was a relatively simple one that we might or might not feel the appeal of. The promise was, tomorrow you'll have fun. The book is basically about the conditions of possibility for an aging president elected for the second time, dancing with a group who were once queer icons but became part of a certain normative and normal popular culture, promising his audience fun, albeit a fun that becomes and blurs into a violent fun of damage and destruction to others, reminding us always that fun is a dangerous, ambiguous affect, something that crosses over into disorder, something that crosses over into its own modes of violence. The book is placed within what we term, drawing upon the work of Stuart Hall and others, which we can say more about in questions what we call the conjunctural crisis, the advent of which, although clearly the tendencies for which predate this, follow from the 2008 financial crisis. A conjunctural crisis that, to borrow Hall, paraphrasing Althusser, involves the fusing together of a set of contradictions into a ruptural unity that we feel and find performed across a range of different kind of signs and symptoms of crisis. So the conjunctural crisis is performed on the one hand through the emergence of a series of political figures who in different ways break with a certain tone and a certain set of gestures surrounding formal politics. So from the right, figures like Donald J. Trump, figures like Boris Johnson, and from the left in the US, someone like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. So the conjunctural crisis is performed in the emergence, in the kind of crossing over into a threshold around political figures. It's also and simultaneously performed in the emergence of formal and informal political movements that happen particularly, or they kind of cross a threshold of consistency, one could say, in the kind of like 2010 period. Again, from the right and much commented upon, the re-emergence of certain variants of right-wing populism, differentiated across the US and UK context, but nevertheless having a certain consistency we'll talk about in a moment. On the left, the flourishing of various kind of oppositional movements, partly movements of kind of almost kind of emergent left populism that never quite crosses that threshold of consistency that right-wing populism does, but also the flourishing of, for example, environmental protest. It's a period where claims of climate emergency are emerging. So you have critiques of the consensus from both left and right simultaneously in this post-2008 period. What both do, we argue in the book, is that they render fragile and result in cracks, and we're phrasing that quite carefully, cracks in the felt sense that there is no alternative. So what Mark Fisher very astutely diagnosed in the 2000s as capitalist realism, the kind of preemptive delegitimation of any alternatives and the production of a kind of grudging acquiescence to a particular set of neoliberal ways of organising policy and economy. And it's that felt sense, that kind of atmosphere of there is no alternative, which becomes fragile and which multiple kind of cracks emerge in it. All of which is part of a kind of crisis in the extension and intensification of various neoliberal logics and modes of government. And it's into that kind of conjunctural moment, a conjunctural moment which also, and at the same time, involves a kind of that crisis playing out in the realm of various cultural forms and practices that we can talk more about. It's into that kind of conjunctural crisis that Anna and I attempt to kind of diagnose something of what was happening in the realm, in particular, of formal politics. So over to Anna to talk a little bit about the book and what we're trying to do with it.
Great, thanks. And thanks to you for that over-the-top introduction. And for the organizing, yes. So, as Ben has indicated, the book and this talk focus on the politics of feeling in the UK and the US in the post-2008 period, but really in a much shorter recent time frame. And what we're looking at is the collapse in both societies, though differently, of the promises that ideologies of capitalist modernism and liberal democracy had fostered. Our interest is in how, in the US and the UK today, politics is motivated and played out through collective political feelings. We argue that today's competing political forms of right-wing populism, left progressivism, and contemporary liberalism are best understood and critiqued not as ideologies per se, but in terms of the politics of feeling. That is to say, rather than primarily functioning as coherent programs of political thought, values, and policy imperatives, today these political forms work by distributing attachment and intensity, by aggregating rallying points, provocations to outrage, sites of exhilaration and enjoyment, and modes of political performance. This is not to say that there are no political programs attached to them, no ideological differences, but it is instead to delve into how these political formations work affectively, that is, through feelings, to differentiate and organize political contestation within these two Western democratic societies in our current moment. Rather than positing a shared public mood, such as an age of anxiety, in the politics of feeling, we analyze today's political forms and the figures, events, and movements that compose them as differentiated affective fields that respond to contemporary conditions, precarity, loss of the future, and the digitally mediated present, and reflect the uneven distribution of these conditions across class, race, gender, and other differences, and finally, that work to actively differentiate, to produce difference in the political field. So when we refer to these political forms, populism, progressivism, liberalism, not as alternative ideologies, but as political feelings, we are signaling our engagement with Raymond Williams's well-known but endlessly enigmatic concept of structures of feeling. This concept has been productively taken up and developed by Ben Highmore, Becky Coleman, and others, but the importance of this concept for us is how it opens onto a space between affect and ideology. Structures of feeling are political forms that are at once recognizable orientations and at the same time in process, shifting and unsettled. So even what might gain the marginal coherence of a structure of feeling does not form a singular totality. These are loose weaves, zones where a degree of consistency happens, enough to be recognized and even named, to become semantically available in Williams's terms. I already said that. So, as we take the notion of structures of feeling into the political present, we also transform it in correspondence to the material conditions and concerns of our day. The most significant way that we do this is by activating questions of difference at the heart of the politics of feelings. There are three main ways that we bring questions of difference to the fore in our analysis of the politics of feeling. First, we emphasize the multiplicity of structures of feeling themselves. The book is not a structure of feeling, right? A politics of feeling. It's about multiple politics of feeling. And the other thing we do is we explore these structures of feeling, their unevenness and their holes, the way that they attract some people, expel other people, and even for the ones who mostly identify with them, there may be holes to which these people drop when they just don't feel, well, where they become affect aliens, let's say. And third, we examine not only how they operate differentially, like drawing different people towards them, but actively produce difference in relations of domination. Who gets caught up in political feelings? Who is inflamed and who is alienated? Who is conditioned by circumstances? This is conditioned by circumstances, orientations, and lived identities, whether you feel attracted, excited, or repelled, or simply numb. So while the politics of feeling concerns the circulation of collective feelings, the capacity to share in a particular moment or scene, like Trump dancing with the village people, is differentiated across and within societies. The idea that there are multiple structures of feeling in the present rather than a structure of feeling characterizing an era thus becomes one way that we open up Williams's concept. So, not only does difference mediate an organized collective feeling, but the reverse is also true. Structures of feeling are not only shaped by difference, but they produce difference. They differentiate. As political formations, they distribute capacities for certain feelings, orientations, across different subjects, sites, and scenes. For example, consider this. In 2021, who had the capacity to be angry at governments about lockdown? And who, on the other hand, was able to be angry at individuals who chose not to mask or become vaccinated? While it may be unsurprising that populist anti-elitism finds expression in pandemic and vaccine skepticism, it is not a given that progressives and liberals would be more in favor of regimes of obedience or be more concerned than others about their own health. Feelings such as chafing at government regulation or fearing a novel virus, feelings that one could theoretically imagine being available to anyone, if differently, instead emerged in these times as collective and political. Visceral reactions were conditioned in the real time of their unfolding by broader patterns and associations that they also participated in creating. One could say that the patterned distribution of these feelings did not just reflect pre-established differences in society, but worked to differentiate the socio-political affective present. Another thing that we aim to kind of talk about that kind of shakes up ideas about structures of feeling as they have been talked about before is about this kind of idea that politics of feeling are now verging away from a common sense or a middle. So rather than a Thatcherite common sense or ideological hegemony in the Gramscian sense, today's political formations are constantly shifting, often gaining momentum as they veer away from yesterday's common sense onto the terrain of the more radical, the less familiar. And while there may be local hegemonies, such as a set of attitudes and values that define a particular industry, like the tech industry, media, or higher education, these localized common senses are unable to lay claim to being the dominant ideas of a society or an age. There are alternatives. In response to our current geohistorical conjuncture and the challenges to living that it poses, we ask again, what is it that assembles in a political formation such as right-wing populism, progressivism, or today's embattled liberalism? How do people become swept up or sucked in, repelled, or dropped out of these loosely knit political consistencies? I'm going to hand over back to Ben.
So for the remainder of the talk, we're going to offer a diagnosis of each political form around how they, to use Anna's phrasing, distribute and redistribute intensity and attachment. Just a note before I begin talking about right-wing populism, two things. One, just to amplify something mentioned by Anna. Our argument in the book is that each of the three political forms is a differentiated and differentiating response to three shared conditions that are once political, economic, and affective. So they're all in different ways responses to, number one, the intensification and the spreading of precarity. Both on the one hand in terms of precarious forms of labour, but on the other hand a sense of precariousness, by which we mean simultaneously insecurity in the present and uncertainty about the future. So you can say more about how we're thinking about precarity and precariousness if we wish in questions. The second partially connected condition that they all respond to in some way or another is what we're terming, after Berardi and others, the loss of the future. Now, what's meant by that, we argue, is something really quite specific, the loss of the future of progressive betterment. The idea that the future is better than the present, which was in turn better than the past. In other words, although the line might be bumpy, it's a continuous line. Now, of course, that form of temporality was only ever available to certain forms of life and was built on the back of dispossessions, but nevertheless, there is that form of temporality kind of like folded into various normative and normalized forms of life. The idea of a career, for example. The idea of progression through various stages of life, for example. And it's that form of temporality that is in crisis, that all three respond to. And then finally, they all respond to the digital mediation of the present, by which we mean a change in the feeling of the present moment. Both the kind of speeding up and the intensification of the present as it kind of expands and stretches, but also the emergence of all kinds of digital practices that in different ways change our experiences of the present moment, from liking, scrolling, swiping, etc. So they're all differentiated responses to those three conditions. The book is and the second thing I wanted to note, the book is a series of propositions. So we basically offer propositions about each political form. We do that through a fairly wild set of empirical scenes, moments over the last kind of 15 years, crossing between popular culture, formal politics, and everything in between. So the kind of epistemology of the book is doubled. It's a multiplication of scenes, and it's a series of diagnostic propositions. Those propositions are designed to foster disagreement. They're offerings, as it were, to enable a space of dissensus. In other words, to enable a political discussion. So when we offer them, we invite you to disagree with them, hate them, think they are ridiculous, whatever relation you may have with them. So right-wing populism. Affirmative, excessive, optimistic. Three propositions. Let us begin with the first. During the Capitol insurrection, Donald J. Trump made an appeal to political actors who were presumably his supporters. We love you. You're very special. The appeal ended. For us, this exemplifies something we consider it difficult to talk about, but central to the appeal of right-wing populism. On the one hand, it offers affirmation to those who may or may not feel like affirmation has been withheld from them or given to others. It involves saying to particular kind of populations, you are good and you are special. And you have hitherto, in some way or another, been overlooked or unacknowledged in comparison to others. This is partly what the discourse, which is in some ways problematic discourse of the left behind, is trying to name and kind of provide a kind of sociological explanation of. And in that promise of affirmation is simultaneously a promise of recognition. In other words, in that respect, right-wing populism is not necessarily a break with liberalism. It kind of extends a sort of strangely a project of recognition that says to certain kind of populations who might feel, to use Wendy Brown's term, the kind of dethroning, particular in relation to the politics of race and kind of whiteness and white masculinity, that we recognise you and we affirm you as good and necessary. Now, where we consider this to be a vital break with neoliberalism, or at least certain ways of formulating neoliberal subjects, is that this is absolutely a break with the responsibilisation of the individual. So effectively, it says, no matter what has befallen you, or something that you value and are attached to and care about, be it a particular community, be it a nation, whatever has befallen you is not your responsibility. It's not a matter of your choices, bad or kind of stupid choices. It's a matter of something or someone outside of you that has taken or stolen or been given too much recognition and affirmation in comparison to you. In other words, right-wing populism is a politics of absolution. And it's a politics of absolution, which means that it's a necessary feature of the kind of affective logic, as it were, that there must be an other, or at least actually a doubled other, who is responsible if you yourself are not responsible for the misfortune that has before than you. And as we know, and we're not going to belabor this point, that other is doubled in right-wing populism. On the one hand, it's that which has given too much recognition or affirmation to the wrong kinds of subjects. In other words, the elite, the establishment, whatever term is used, and it almost doesn't matter. But structurally, some kind of group who are the group who have given too much to the wrong group. But on the other hand, and of course, right-wing populism involves an intensified resentment, which leads into other-orientated anger and hate and the various forms of violence that we're currently seeing, particularly in the American context, that follows from that. In other words, kind of various racialized or minoritized subjects who are those who have also taken or been given too much affirmation or recognition. So resentment is not a kind of contingent feature of right-wing populism. It's absolutely it's a necessity to enable that affirmation and recognition and enable the redistribution of that affirmation and recognition. Second proposition, and I should have noted, any attempt to diagnose like what has happened in politics since 2008 in basically a half-an-hour talk is going to be a massive failure. There's like a gigantic failure, right? Because we just have to go really quick. But we thought we'll go really quick across all the propositions and we'll see what happens. We'll see if there's anything which kind of connects in some way or another. How many of you recognise the figure there? Exactly. An Asian wrestler, I think real name Terry Bollea, better known by his stage name Hulk Hogan. Introducing Donald J. Trump at the Republican National Convention the year before his re-election as president. Hulk Hogan began fully clothed and then ripped off his suit and screaming something like, I can't remember exactly what it was now, so I won't actually repeat it. It was something like, "Make America great again, go Trump, go." Something along those lines. The second event there is Boris Johnson driving a forklift truck through a polystyrene wall. The forklift truck has the phrase "Get Brexit done." Boris Johnson emerges, stumbling a little bit, outside of the forklift truck, shouts "Get Brexit done," gestures at the polystyrene things on the floor, and then the media move on. Two examples of our second proposition. Populism is excessive. It involves, on different registers, here the register of kind of fun that draws on various kind of images and practices of popular culture, world wrestling, but sometimes those spectacle of excesses are absolutely intimate with violence towards racialized and minoritized others. Think about the kind of immigration raids and the kind of spectacular logic that we're seeing in the US at the moment. But either way, populism involves scenes of excess. And involves scenes of excess, we argue, to generate an affective difference within the field of politics. That on the one hand differentiates the populist politician from kind of other politicians of different types, but on the other hand generates a kind of energy that then has circulates and percolates through the political field. Gathering kind of other energies to it, gathering reaction and counter-reaction, all of which is necessary for today's attention economy. So the excess produces a kind of difference and differentiation. The excess that we see in an event, as per we began this talk with, of Donald Trump dancing with the village people. So this is not, again, it's not a contingent aspect of right-wing populism. Something you see repeatedly. Think of Musk with the chainsaw, when kind of announcing Dodge. All of these scenes of excess are kind of necessary. Final proposition before I hand on to Anna, who's going to talk about progressivism. Final proposition emerged from a certain dissatisfaction that Anna and I had in some of the ways in which right-wing populism was being diagnosed, around in particular the centrality of feelings of fear and anxiety. Now, of course, that diagnosis is necessary. It connects into our argument that resentment and what follows from resentment is a necessary feature of right-wing populism. It's not contingent, it's necessary. But we argue in our third proposition that this ignores something central to the affective appeal of right-wing populism. It tells a story about how to bring about the good future in the context of that loss of the future of progressive betterment. That is one of the conditions that I summarised all too briefly. The story, I think, is a relatively simple one that is embedded in the two slogans that you will all, I imagine, be familiar with. In the UK, in relation to Brexit, take back control, and in America, make America great again. Both of them perform what we call a time loop optimism. That is a different structure of temporality to the logic of progressive betterment. The time loop optimism can be straightforwardly stated. It's that the good future can be found by returning to the almost but lost past. In other words, it's the word again, back in each statement. And of course, each statement is a promise of agency at the same time, kind of make and take, of course, but that temporal logic of the return to a not quite lost past, which becomes thereafter the good future. Now, what's critical to the right-wing populists' return to the not quite lost past to become the good future is it must involve some kind of break with the here and now. It must involve some kind of dramatic moment where something in the here and now is destroyed or ended to enable that return. In other words, the politics of return is not a conservative politics of conserving what exists into the future. It's a politics that involves some kind of potentially violent act of ending or stopping something in the here and now. In other words, that's why you always see this kind of a narrative of a kind of like a dramatic break with the present conditions, like becomes kind of central to right-wing populism. In other words, right-wing populism has in some respects a revolutionary kind of tone to it, which is quite different to other conservative forms. I said this was going to be really quick. We'll now move on to progressivism.
Which is going to be really, really quick. I'm going to show you what quick means. So when I talk about progressivism, and I think it's interesting just on the note of how, populism has this revolutionary core to it, I'm not talking about revolutionary Marxism, I'm not talking about communism, I'm talking about something that's become known as progressivism. Okay, it's kind of, and it's not the same in the US and the UK exactly. In the book we talk about the kind of the different heritages of progressivism in these two places. But what we were talking about here is something that actually has a fairly short, it says recently emerged as something kind of to the left of liberalism, but to my mind not proper leftism exactly, because it doesn't have the same kind of economic argument or revolutionary tendency. Okay, anyhow. And it's partly why it's not an ideology. Like populism and progressivism both have been sort of like, scholars of ideology say, they're not really ideologies, maybe a thin ideology, maybe something that can be added, like progressivism, you can pop it onto other ideologies. It could be an element of an ideology. First proposition for progressivism. I'm just going to give you a sense, not giving you much evidence, just kind of telling you what the argument is. The argument is that for progressivism, the present is disastrous and in need of repair. And that is the starting point for progressive politics historically as well, that is a problem in the present. Today, the signs are everywhere and inescapable. Seen, felt, and understood from the perspective of social justice, the present is little but an accumulation of connected disasters, melting glaciers, homeless encampments, rising food bank use, heat waves, a vicious anti-trans atmosphere, political violence, an endemic anti-blackness, fascism. And alongside and underneath these visible signs of existing dystopias are fast and slow violences that deplete, constrain, and damage people's lives. But salvation cannot be found by returning to a better past. No time loop optimism. For the past was just as bad or worse, especially for women, black and brown people, colonial subjects, LGBTQ plus people. Moreover, the violence and injustices of the past, such as colonialism, slavery, and fossil fuel use, have brought us to our current crisis. Don't bother trying to read that. The crisis of the present and the shadow that has fallen over the future means that progressivism has lost its defining object, its sense of history as a journey of continuous progress towards the good society. With the recognition that what once passed for progress was fossil-fueled and built on the destruction of worlds, progressivism, unlike right-wing populism, cannot alight on an unconditionally good past, except perhaps one buried irretrievably in the pre-modern and pre-colonial age. But the past does offer something. It shimmers with fragments of what Robin Kelly calls freedom dreams, not quite fulfilled moments of action and solidarity that still transmit hope. The progressive structure of feeling revitalizes the present by resurrecting attachment to these moments, infusing them into an exhausted present. Progressivism thus repairs its timeline by patching together these pieces, in like the civil rights movement, like moments in the civil rights movement, or women's rights, the suffrage movement. They kind of patch it together and promise that that this past can become fully redeemed within a heightened present that is tasked with rescuing the future. Apocalyptic politics, as pervasive as these are, and as potentially well-founded, puts progressivism into an impasse. To be blunt, projecting a bad future unfolding from the bad present, which itself follows from the mounting wreckage of the bad past, subverts the idea of progress and progressive thought. If what the past has seeded and what lies dormant in our present is catastrophe, then it hardly seems like a time to blow the horn of progress. Our proposition is that this paradox is not incidental to the affective structure of progressivism today, but in fact is the fission that fuels it. So how does progressivism arise after its time has passed? And this is an article, an American article from 2020 saying the past 4 years have birthed the progressive movement, and those are what were called the pussy hats, the little pink hats, anti-Trump at that time. But that's just to kind of indicate people are seeing this as something that has arisen fairly recently. So on the surface, the rise of what has been named progressivism today, explicitly in the US, less so in the UK, poses a bit of a puzzle. How has progressivism managed to resurge after the presumption of inevitable progress associated with modernity has been gutted? Progressivism's impasse can be encapsulated in the affective charge that buzzes between the anti-capitalist mantra, "Another world is possible," and the slogan, "There is no planet B," or Plan B, which originated in climate activism in Britain. At the same time as progressivism attaches to the hopeful possibility of another world, it raises the question of the relationship between this other possible good world and the one that we currently inhabit, the one that seems to be spinning towards a catastrophic horizon. In the book, we argue that this conundrum is at once an impasse and an engine. It generates progressive intensity, differentiates the progressive structure of feeling, and ultimately perpetuates the urgency of action in the present. Everything is amplified, quickened, and sharpened in the digitally mediated present. It is a time of high drama. Will Smith slapping Chris Rock on the stage at the 2022 Academy Awards is just one example of an event that, at the time, could not be called trivial. Or rather, calling it trivial itself carries the weight of an untrivial statement, demonstrating a detachment that itself matters and has effects. Everything is at stake, not simply in the event, but in the right response to it. To get something wrong is consequential, a sign of being wrong. The right response belongs to the righteous. Framing the political arena as a moral realm, progressive feeling pivots on the question of personal responsibility, guilt, reparation, and punishment. Along with projecting past catastrophe into the future, elevating the significance of right action and reaction in the present amplifies the political agency of the individual, the potentially global significance of their actions. So this is the intense present. In these times, progressivism promises that the right action now, no matter how individual or fleeting, has the power to set progressive time back on track. Infused with feelings of urgency, the progressive structure of feeling nurtures the fragile hope that action in the present can still make a difference, that the worst future can be averted, that there can be a fork in the road or a branch in the timeline. Hope might not be felt, might even be rejected, but it is not extinguished if urgent action happens right now. It is late, just not too late. The progressive gaze turns from the catastrophe to come to the present, in which redemption for the past is still possible.
So let's turn finally to the third of the three political forms, liberalism. And the challenge liberalism faces is how to return itself to the status of felt common sense. These propositions, if we were to be glib about it, could be subtitled Why the Starmer Project in the UK Has Run into Crisis So Quickly. And hopefully it'll become apparent why that's the case. First proposition, that which had been taken for granted, that which had been common sense, that which had been met with the forms of acquiescence and grudging acceptance that Mark Fisher diagnoses, now must be defended in a way that it never needed to before. So an element of liberalism today is the issuing of defences of it by various figures associated with the kind of post-1989 consensus. One example of this by Francis Fukuyama. It turns out history has not ended. In fact, history has begun again with a newfound intensity. And in this context of history beginning again, liberalism must be defended. But what's fascinating about these defences of liberalism is that they must always come with a caveat. The defence cannot be unambivalent. The defence has to be accompanied with an acknowledgement of liberalism's past failure. It must be accompanied by qualifications and caveats. So here, note the, or if the term is too fraught with certain historical connotations, then what Deirdre McCluskey labels humane liberalism. What animates and kind of energises these different defences of liberalism is their sense that liberalism is once again under threat. So you have the genres of defence. Genres of defence which take a particular form. On the one hand, they attempt to reassert that there has actually been progress. That the time of liberal common sense associated with the aftermath of 1989 was a time of progress, that the near past, the present was better than the near past, and that although something has gone wrong in the present moment, because of the emergence of right-wing populism, because of the emergence of progressivism, that near past of progress can be returned to. So the present is typically framed, and Fukuyama does this, Tony Blair does this, Obama, etc. do this. It's framed effectively as a choice of moving forward in linear time that in effect reproduces that temporality of progressive betterment, or a retreat, like a loss of liberalism's, albeit contingent, progress. But at the same time, these defences of liberalism all must acknowledge liberalism's failure and offer a different promise that this time things will be better. Yes, there were inequalities associated with globalisation, but this time there won't be. Yes, there was the production of disposable populations, but this time things will be different. In other words, the just about holding on to liberal progress is a fragile formation. And it's a fragile formation that requires some kind of energetics to enable liberalism to return to common sense. In other words, it requires what Fukuyama calls, in a series of pieces about the Ukraine war, a revival of the spirit of 1989. A spirit that he associates with basically the becoming common sense after the victory of kind of liberalism. In other words, a huge amount of kind of faith is placed in the Ukraine war as a kind of animating force that will enable liberalism to return to common sense. A reawakening of a dormant spirit, apparently. So there's a hope for a revival of liberal passion. However, our second proposition is that liberalism faces a crisis of attachment. So, as it attempts to generate a renewal of passion for it, various kind of almost but not quite lost kind of like objects that could be attached to are offered and presented, but all of them fail to do the work of returning liberalism to common sense. These idealised, almost lost objects are many and multiple. In some ways, the specificity of them matters less than they're all offered as the things that we should reattach to enable liberal common sense to be returned to. What is produced, we argue in the book, is a particular formation of melancholy, a form of liberal melancholia, where it's liberalism that can't mourn the loss of its previous kind of like objects that were apparently attached to. In other words, instead of left melancholia, a political affective formation emergent in that post-1989 moment, it's now liberalism that becomes melancholy as it's under attack from left and right, as it can't return itself to the states of felt common sense. It becomes a melancholy formation where various not quite lost objects cannot be mourned and yet are never kind of present as such. What this means is that this dangerous kind of lack of love for liberalism and its objects needs to be explained. And we argue in the book it's explained in two ways. First, it's explained through the extreme and intense delegitimation of the left. This is, of course, a well-known phenomena that kind of liberalism saves its most vehement in attacking the left rather than right. And so you have, and it's the left which need, we argue, to be aggressively delegitimated if liberalism is to become common sense again. Alongside the delegitimation of the left, who are responsible for this dangerous lack of love for liberalism, you have a rotating series of characters who become kind of the focus of explanation for why liberalism has been broken with. Steve Bannon, Dominic Cummings, Russia, Facebook, postmodernism. Whatever it might be, these different figures, these different events, these different movements all serve the role of explaining why liberalism was broken with. And what they enable is a kind of liberal proximity to the passions and pleasures of conspiracy theory, which I think is a very underdiagnosed element of contemporary liberalism. It's kind of intimacy with conspiratorial. And here we're in dialogue with Victoria Ridgway's incredible work on conspiratorial thinking, which I would really recommend people read. So in the midst of this liberal melancholy, in the midst of this attempt to explain the dangerous lack of liberalism, you have various attempts to kind of reactivate what we call ossified promissory objects. The idea of truth, or in particular the EU rejoin moment that kind of intensified and has now basically dissipated. We see it as performing the function of attempting to return liberalism to its common sense, but failing. Which leads us to our third proposition. In a context where the defence of liberalism can only ever be contingent and caveated, in a context where various promissory objects cannot bear the weight of returning liberalism to common sense, liberalism offers a promise that nothing ever need change, that you can return back to your previous situation of withdrawing from the scene of politics, a scene that has become too much, full of the intensity of disagreement and dissensus, full of actors who enrage and engage you. Liberalism's promise is you don't need to feel all this anymore. In other words, it's a promise of withdrawal. And I think critical here, this is Obama talking before Joe Biden's election, and it's critical that the scene he uses is effectively in the family home, or the kind of extended family. In other words, one can kind of like enjoy your normative forms of life once again without politics, with its intensities, with its disagreements intruding and disrupting that. There's a kind of reproduction of the kind of family unit as kind of safe space here. Now this, of course, this promise was absolutely central to Keir Starmer's election, alongside the offering of the ossified promissory object that was never going to generate attachment to it because of its abstraction of growth. So Starmer's promise, one part of it, was that because he was boring, things could once again return to normality. But it was an ambivalent promise, because at various points Keir Starmer let it be known via the media that he didn't like being called boring. So it's a kind of like his kind of political use of boredom was a very ambivalent one. But here you see him effectively distinguishing himself from the politics of excess that is both vital to right-wing populism and other forms. In other words, the promise that boredom can end history again. We can stop all this bad intensity by withdrawing from the political realm. Now that, of course, is a fairly weak, fragile promise that is very unlikely to garner the sort of return of liberalism to its common sense position. In other words, liberalism has a structural crisis. We will conclude there with a little note on we basically finished writing the book. We wrote the afterwords of the book the day after Donald J. Trump's second election.
Yeah. And I know we're out of time, so I'm not going to spend time on this, but I just want to say that at least with regard to the United States and Trump's first year in office, it's time for another book. I mean, certainly, things have really changed. I think, like nobody's really calling Trump a right-wing populist exactly anymore. The question is, he's more authoritarian than that. He's more, like the question on the table is more fascism, and it's also less about the future and more about the present. Like, it's not necessarily emergent, it's already arrived. So I think that's, so I think like things have really changed there. And also the overt nihilism of his administration and his supporters really seems to rise above kind of questions of love or optimism about the future or anything like that, because because of the destructiveness, I would say. So anyhow, I think that things have shifted around in that regard. I think that like progressivism, like before Trump's second election, you were often, at least I was often not sure whether too much was being made of something or not. Like, is this overblown? Like, or is it right? Well, it wasn't overblown really, but I think that partly also people in the U.S. who are progressives or left are fighting a very everyday battle right now, and I think this things are different. So I think a lot of what we wrote about with progressivism, it was about a particular moment, because we were writing about the present. It was, and that was kind of the point. We were trying to like unfold the present, like go into the present, express the present. But that means that the world is a moving target, and liberalism is banging its drum louder than ever in the United States, and also blaming progressives, especially in the left, saying, "Look what you've done." Right? It's your fault. This has happened now, and it's interesting. I've just been reading a lot about Weimar Germany, like, well, the communist leftists got the blame there too for questioning democracy. Okay.
And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna and Ben, for that really fantastic talk. I think there's just so much sort of generative tools for thinking in this book, both about kind of the near past and, as you've said, really engaging ideas for thinking about what's changed and how we might use these ideas in this kind of movement of thinking about the sort of conjuncture of feeling and the everyday and these really eventful moments. I want to do a quick plug for the book, so I really encourage everyone to read it. It's a fantastic read. It's Goldsmiths University Press, an imprint of MIT, and you can also read it as an ebook through the University of Manchester Library, so if you want to read it there, you can. We have some time for some questions, so I'll open it up to the room. Right there, back here. Thank you. I think it's loud enough, but we have a mic if we need it. But
hello, thank you very much for the talk. I have a question regarding progressivism, and there have been scholars like Chris Hedges, Gabriel Rockel. They have said that performative and consumerist progressivism has actually hindered a lot in left-wing action. Like you don't see a Eugene Debs or Malcolm X in the American society. Consumerism has rather taken over. I would actually even say that's an illustration in many of the pro-Palestine protests, because there's no serious engagement with what happens in Palestine. No one's talking about Chomsky. They're talking about how Israeli products have been boycotted. Flotilla is an exception. Like in Spanish Civil War, Hemingway actually went and fought. That's not happening in Western progressivism. And also, do Western progressives undermine other systems? For example, in China, China has 14 schools of thought in its Communist Party, and all actually what you hear from Western progressives is mockery and calling it authoritarianism. It's like 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty, whereas here progressivism has led to Farage or Trump and MAGA. So the answer is clear, which seems to be more beneficial to the world. So yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate this comment, and I think that I mean, in some ways, exactly those kinds of thoughts underlie, the critique of progressive affect in some ways, insofar that one delimits progressivism and says, so because of the concept of progress, that just basically rules out revolution, right? Yeah. And certainly is taken form that is very society and spectacle-ish. And so I do think, I think that what you've expressed about it makes perfect sense to me. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering, what about, thank you for the presentation, by the way. I think I will buy the book. And you also said that you will go more into the differences between the two contexts in the book. But I was really curious about it, because not about what happened after 2024, but in the timeline you focused on, in terms of affect. What are some of the differences that you see between the UK and the US, especially about populism and liberalism? Because of course, there's a lot of cultural exchange between the two countries, but there's also some the history of the institutional context is different. Maybe racial relations are different in the past and now. Also, the UK's close relations with the EU. So, what are some of the diverging types of affect that you would see in populism and liberalism specifically?
Yeah. And one thing that, it was definitely something we were navigating in writing about populism was kind of a difference in you could see Johnson doing goofy things and then Trump doing horrific things. Sometimes. So they kind of juxtaposing them sometimes was a bit awkward. They didn't it was a different, just a different context, a whole different vibe. Actually, they had very different vibes. But what we were actually looking at more than how they diverged was actually how they converged, and converged around spectacle and excess and promises that. And of course, Farage exemplifies it more than Johnson does. But on both sides, of the Atlantic, the promise that you can be great again. And that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like how to articulate our decision to emphasise convergence, and I think we did take a decision to do that, and it was partly to try and work through how those different shared conditions that I identified get kind of like there's a shared way in which they're refracted through right-wing populism, but also I think we thought the convergences mattered more. So like let's take the example there, okay? So like unquestionably there are forms of resentment underpinning and came to the surface in Boris Johnson's kind of like way of performing certain right-wing populism. But you didn't have quite the same intensity of anti-immigrant demonisation like that you had in Trump. So there was a divergence there in the kind of the ways in which kind of structural resentment got played out in different performances of other orientated kind of violence and the sort of like forms of kind of like anger and hate that gather around and enable that forms of violence. But I think we thought, okay, but structurally, like resentment is part of both. There's a kind of difference in sort of in the degree to which they form. Now this becomes kind of interesting about whether today now there is a divergence or not, whether actually a kind of shared resentment getting performed kind of like almost like with different degrees of intensity has crossed the threshold to become, you know, whether the American formation we're seeing now actually can no longer be called right-wing populism. That it's kind of that we need to find kind of like a name in the orbit of the term fascism, perhaps.
Or Trumpism.
Yeah. Yeah. And then kind of so I think there was a decision about convergence, which I think not least because it's always possible to find differences.
Makes sense to focus on convergence.
Yeah. Eric?
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic diagnostic of our times, in which you quite rightly foreground the importance of structures of feeling and affect and libidinal attachment. I have two questions. On the one hand, you say very little about why it is, how we can account for the fact that structures of feeling trump reason, rationality, public reason, private reason, the kind of classic foundations upon which political reason has been established. Why is it? And I would agree with you to say very little about the origin, the drivers of that. And then secondly, is of course these structures of feeling vary from place to place, from time to time. If you would do the same story for the 1950s, you would come up with a completely different set.
Yeah.
Or if you were to do it for different countries, like I think Spain, who just last week regularized 500,000 immigrants, which would be impossible to even imagine in the UK or the US. So again, that would be a different set. So my second question then is, what are the lessons, the implications of your analysis and for the grounding of libidinal attachment, of structures of feeling, for strategies of change with respect to the deadlock that we're in?
I mean, the reason why we're laughing about the strategy, take the second one first. One of the things the referees for the book asked for, the only thing they really agreed on, was our desire, so they formed the desire for us to tell them what should be done. In other words, kind of like it is, the book is a work of diagnostic critique. And in some ways it's easy to critique like that which you politically disagree with. You know, right-wing populism, it's far harder to critique that which you're imbricated in some ways or another. Progressivism, let's say. So we wondered for quite a while about how to respond to that desire for us to identify what should or could be done. And we played around for a while actually with the idea of that, you know, that the left should generate like new hybrid feelings. Like we came up with all these kind of crazy names for different kind of feelings that would merge different elements. So kind of,
my favorite was panic optimism.
Yeah, panic optimism. That's one of the things. Which of course kind of like folds into like environmental movements, Andreas Malm's stuff, etc. Right? So, but we ended up pulling back from that, and I think in a really way which would be dissatisfying for a lot of readers. And we pulled back from it, partly because
we don't want to satisfy people.
I think there is a little bit of that, right? But we also pulled back from it for two reasons. Number one, we actually, we really believe in the necessity of a diagnosis, like diagnostic critique. We consider that to be like a necessary condition for kind of like political strategy. And then secondly, we considered that other people can do that work kind of like better than us, you know? And in some ways, kind of like it would be a sort of like fictional performance of a kind of authority for us to say, right, okay, the left needs to have a program of panic optimism. Now that doesn't. There's a kind of interesting thing there, because I do think, you know, there are absolutely like almost in the best spirit of conjuncture analysis. It's like, okay, what are the pressure points, right? Where are elements, let's say the formation in the UK right now. No, it's evident from our diagnosis that if a new government, Labour, get in, and the first thing they say is the future is going to be worse, and you're going to have to come to terms with reduced living standards, which effectively is what Labour did. That like makes absolutely no affective sense whatsoever on the basis of our diagnosis. So there are, in fact, you couldn't imagine something which was more likely to create the conditions that we've seen for the emergence of reform. So it's almost like, okay, there were all these like contingent pressure points, and in that context, it's kind of not even that deep. It's like, okay, what are the forms of optimism that a left could perform now in the context of that impasse that progressivism faces and the loss of its object, the progress, and other claims to the future that you see from liberalism, that you see from right-wing populism. You know, like a simple kind of strategy would be the left needs to have a story about the future, right? So there's all these kind of contingent articulations that we could, but we sort of withdrew from being those kind of subjects who would do that, which I've just kind of done.
And to your earlier question about why do we have more passion than reason in the political realm, my first instinct is to answer something about our current digitally mediated present, let's say, our current technological situation. But I've been recently reading, Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And he writes about, like, people have said that the reason why basically we lost the workers to fascism, why they didn't, is because, and the book, by the way, is from, it was first written in 1936 and then revised in the 40s, but he says the reason why that people have been saying that is because of misinformation in the newspapers, propaganda, that like basically that these people were misinformed. But he says that's not it. There is a psychological reason why people are drawn to fascism. There is an attachment that can emerge. And so in that sense, I think, well, he was dealing with the same problem. And the answer, it's the technology, or it's the media, it's social media, whatever it is, might be the same kind of wrong answer in the sense that he dismissed in his book. And yet you could also say, well, it's kind of been a long trajectory of becoming more and more rapid and reactive in the public realm.
Yeah, and I think you can articulate as well with other longer-term tendencies in changes in forms of capitalism. So, for example, like the emergence of kind of forms of affective and other types of immaterial labour, whereby consumers are like interpolated, kind of like to be subject to feel, like the buzz, kind of like a place, Even longer-term trajectories are like, I don't agree with all of it, but I'm taken by, I don't think Tristan Garcia's argument about the importance of intensity to the production of the modern subject. And I think there is something there that kind of like, the modern subject has always been an intense subject who desires something like excitement, sort of desires to be moved in some way. So I think an articulation.
Yeah, the convergence of advertisement and politics in the consumer society.
Yeah. So yeah.
Great. In the back, and then.
Hi, thank you for a really fascinating discussion. I think the provocations are really fruitful and have a lot to say. Something that I was caught at the end when you talked about kind of moving into a more nihilistic phase of possible sort of fascism, not possible fascism. And I was just wondering, in these categories
in some ways, yes, you can, like, I mean, you know, for example, the traveling of excessive performance to the dens.
Yeah.
That was one thing I thought of.
Yeah, do people remember, you may or may not, at the last general election, so Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrat, performed a wide array of stunts. One was like bungee jumping, shouting like, vote the Dems. I mean, the very fact I can remember it, like, is illustrative of the success on one level of that strategy. But so I think, like, almost kind of like, yeah, excess is a great one, which I think does now move between. And other progressivism and excess is kind of an interesting one, because, like, I can't necessarily, like, there's something about sort of like almost like the dangerousness of excess, the kind of way it can kind of like tip over in disorder that feels like it's not.
The other thing, that kind of intensification of everything matters now, you can see that travel around. I think you know certainly the January 6th insurrection in the U.S. You know, like this election must, this inauguration must not go forward, right? So there was a sense, there must have been a sense, that like today's the day, that action must be taken. So that kind of urgency, I think, it's not only owned by progressivism. Liberalism doesn't quite know how to perform that kind of urgency. I mean, there's a lot of complaint, but yeah.
But I think your question is fascinating because it's something we've talked about publicly before. The book is kind of structural in some respects, as a function partly of the propositional form. It effectively kind of like articulates a logic to each kind of like political form that we take as a structure of feeling. In other words, we take the structure part of structural feeling like far more seriously.
Yeah, and for each one we talk about kind of the past, the present, and the future, like how they imbue that with feeling. Yeah. So
the question of what are the disjunctures, what are the sort of like ways in which they kind of merge and blur is really important. But also the kind of question, which is kind of counter to your question almost, of where are the kind of reactions and counter reactions to the tone. So for example, like the sort of everything matters nowness of progressivism, the kind of anti-woke, inverted commas, kind of sort of like the importance of the kind of anti-woke to contemporary kind of far right is precisely because the anti-woke is a counter-reaction to the progressive everything matters now. So you have all these kind of complicated reactions and counter-reactions, as well as kind of overlaps and alliances, which sort of undermine the kind of structural logic that kind of reproduce at the same time.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just have a question about like self-reflection in liberalism. So I'm Canadian, and the more populism is on the rise, the more I reflect on like liberal politics in my own country. And like for instance, there's like Bill C8 and other bills that the liberal government since Trudeau have been trying to pass, like the Online Harms Act and all these things that are essentially going to allow the government to open your mail whenever they want, shut down your internet without warning. And there are huge jail sentences for things that they see as like supporting terrorism, which they don't define. And like if I ask liberal friends about these policies, they have no idea, and they actually think I'm wrong, that this is happening. But of course, if it was the conservatives pushing it, it would be a big deal. And then on top of that, we have Carney who gave a speech at Davos, like saying, "Oh, the liberal order isn't working, so we need to make new alliances." Well, it hasn't been working for a lot of people for a long time, but only now that it doesn't work for you, now you're talking about it. But there's never self-reflection on their own actions, and actually there seems to be like a doubling down on the ignorance. And so, at least in Canada. So I guess I'm just wondering, are there exceptions? Because at least in my little bubble, like I haven't seen any self-reflection. And I even wrote an op-ed on this a couple years ago before Trump in Canada, calling for self-reflection on their own behaviors before they were thinking of invading Niger after the coup. They were gonna, and they were holding up Canadian flags in Niger, saying like we want Canada out, and then Canada was gonna go and support France and try to overthrow the coup. So anyway, yeah, there was just this constant lack of self.
Oh, you should send us through the op-ed. That would be really interesting to.
Sorry?
You should send us through the op-ed.
Oh.
Yeah, just go like it's interesting.
Well, liberalism must be defended. Exactly, they double down.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
doubling down.
right? Like
Yeah.
this lack of reflection of like how we have, or how liberals have contributed to like so many other issues that we
Yeah, and that's partly why like progressivism becomes such a bugaboo, because they'll say, you know, like liberalism, you know, has only worked for certain people. You know, it's racialized. It's elite ultimately, and, you know, like, and that kind of argument is very, you know, I mean, liberalism may make some reforms, but it's as though from both sides nobody will ever be satisfied.
Yeah, and I wouldn't characterise it, and you didn't use this term, but it wouldn't characterise it as an absence of reflection, nor would I necessarily characterise it as a lack of reflection. I'd characterise it as like a particular form of reflection, which almost kind of like a reflection which must always come with a limit, because the reflection's aim is precisely to re-establish liberalism's common sense.
Yeah.
So it's and the limit of kind of liberalism's reflection must be like anything structurally about liberalism. It effectively, you're able to, the reflection can be, well, in this contingent manifestation of liberalism here, we might have got this thing wrong, but actually, that's just kind of like a particular local manifestation. Really, next time we can do it better.
it's almost like, does that make it worse, right? Like this very, very specific limits that they put on this topic.
Yeah, so it's a kind of, and I think we talk a lot about how effectively right-wing populism, like, is a genre without self-reflection. Like, can you imagine a figure like Farage or kind of Trump performing kind of like the self-reflection that we do see from kind of like historically very central, historically by which I mean post-1989, central liberal figures?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, liberalism is the only one that actually has an ideology, right? Like, the only one that, like, you could say, like, this is a liberal program.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, we're saying, you know, that whole claim of, like, liberal rationality is kind of, like, they're getting rather inflamed themselves.
Oh, completely. Completely. Yeah, you cannot say liberalism is dispassionate now.
Right. Stefan, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I had a question not about the structures of feeling, but more about the infrastructures of feeling. I was wondering if that comes through in what you saw, because we're seeing a geography to these fascists and populism. There are areas where it resonates more, areas where it doesn't, and all the other propositions you made also have a very clear distribution. And someone said it's not just about the digital medium, but it's about other forms of engagement, other forms of resonance. I don't know whether that comes through at all, and what maybe those other mediums maybe these feelings propagate might be.
Yeah, I mean the quick and blunt answer is that we don't focus on those infrastructures of feeling in the book. While at various points we do more than acknowledge, we sort of effectively say that these structures of feeling are kind of like enacted and translated through the enactment in diverse contexts through situated subjects involved in all manner of relations with others, right? Which is a kind of generic get out. In part because of what the book's trying to do in terms of that diagnostic critique, working on convergences across contexts. You could write a completely different book, which would be about infrastructures of feeling, and I think that book would focus, I think you put it really well, that there may be multiple mediums for multiple coexisting infrastructures. For example, one infrastructure might be the accumulation of multiple everyday encounters that people have in the course of their everyday life with the state. Another might be the accumulation of everyday encounters people have with the various kind of threats and spectres that hover over and cloud how we relate to the future. Another might be the kind of forms of digital mediation, but as they're actually lived and practiced in everyday life. In other words, kind of how we scroll while talking to a friend, etc. So you could build quite a complicated sense of kind of like multiple coexisting infrastructures that I think would kind of be less a kind of like locational geography, as it were, and will be more kind of, okay, what are the material and affective conditions for particular particular subjects, like grasping or kind of like resonating with the affective appeal of these different formations. And then you would lead to the kind of quite complicated question, which we also don't address, of how that the accumulation across those of affects across all those infrastructures fold back into the structures of feeling and give those structures of feeling a kind of dynamism. Because I guess another critique of our book is it's quite a sort of we try and do it with the scenes, but we don't necessarily focus on the question of how these structures of feeling have changed, how they've remolded, how they've kind of.
Because it's so presentist, it's like, what's the edge, which is always escaping us as we're writing it.
Yeah, and it was one of our questions, the problems, like how do you write the present as the present is emerging? Mm-hmm. I mean, all our work, if social science is belated, like obviously, but it's almost like it was just really fascinating to try and kind of like what you hold on to diagnose the present as it's happening. So in other words, that's a very long-winded way of saying we haven't done that, but it'd be great to do that.
Great, thank you so much. So we're coming to the end of our time. Is there any last burning questions? And one more in the back.